taking place in a committee room of this establishment. It was, after all, Michael in particular who played a crucial role in establishing the system of select committees after 1979 under the political direction of Norman St. John Stevens. And of course, this institution was founded very much with a hope that committees would be central to its work. There are various arguments and debates about how successful that's proven to be, but there is no doubt that, again, in a sense, this institution is also part of Michael's legacy, as well as the select committee system, which we now take for granted, and is central to the operation of Westminster. Now, that said, this is going to be a rather different lecture as compared with most of the memorial lectures. Most of the memorial lectures have been about how Parliament works in some way or another. That, frankly, is not particularly my research interest. What I'm interested in is how people get into Parliament in the first place, in what circumstances, and what are the implications of that for the way in which British democracy works. So this, as it were, is looking at and as a result of that, therefore, I'm effectively going to be looking at the role of Parliament within the wider framework of the system of government inside the UK. Now, be able to do this, I've got to define reasonably precisely what is the model of British politics, of British democracy, and of parliamentary representation, which I regard as being fundamental to at least a traditional conception, traditional post-war conception of how British democracy works. And in my view, central to it, first of all, is the idea that effectively British politics is about alternating two-party majority government, i.e., for some of the time we have the Conservatives in power, and then we get fed up with them, so we put the Labour Party in power, and then we get fed up with them, so we put the Conservatives back in power down by the time they've done due penance, etc., etc. It's a system of alternating but majority government. Most, though not all governments since 1945, have enjoyed a parliamentary majority. And the crucial attribute that it is argued that this delivers is accountability. That basically, at the end of the 4 or 5 years, assuming it's been a reasonably normal length of parliamentary term, the electorate can say to themselves, well, how well have the lot who've been in done? And they either give them a pass mark or a fail mark. If they give them a pass mark, they vote for them. If they give them a fail mark, they vote them out. And the crucial point is, there is no argument about who is responsible for what went wrong in the last 5 years, because there's only one party that was responsible. Now, underpinning that conception is some crucial architecture, both social and political or institutional, constitutional. The social is that effectively that two-party model dominated by Conservative and Labour was underpinned by a demographic division by social class. Middle-class people tended to be more likely to vote Conservative. Working-class people were more likely to vote Labour. After all, Labour was founded to provide working-class representation. And also that our politics was essentially about left versus right, by which I mean, do you think that the state should be doing a bit more to reduce inequality, or should the state be doing a bit more to try and grow the economy, thereby ensuring that there is more for everybody to have? The argument was essentially an economic one. The institutional foundation is the single-member plurality electoral system, otherwise known as first past the post, that has two crucial qualities, according to its advocates, that help to deliver this conception of British two-party democracy. The first is that it exaggerates the lead of the largest party over the second party. So if the Labour Party is first, it's going to get more than its fair, quote-unquote, share of seats. But equally, if the Conservatives are first, they will equally get more than their fair share of seats. So that even though neither party very often gets as much as 50% of the vote, they nearly always get a parliamentary majority. And that helps to deliver the idea of majority government. But the second thing, which is also crucial to this, is that the system keeps third parties out. And if you remember, those of you who remember the politics of the 1960s, basically you could put all the members of the Parliamentary Liberal Party in a cab, pay the fare for them to go to Brighton, and nobody would notice for the day, because there were only half a dozen of them. And the point is that in the heyday of post-war British politics, very few MPs were other than a little Conservative or a little Labour. So that's the model whose continued validity and foundations is what I want to look at, primarily in the wake of what happened in 2024, but then also a little bit about what has happened since. To do that, I'm going to address 4 questions. The first is to just do a little bit about, well, were voters voting in 2024 in order to hold the then incumbent government to account? Then, more substantially, what's happened to those traditional underpinnings of the two-party system? That is, class equals vote and left versus right dominates our politics. Is that still the case? Thirdly, what's happened to the operation of our electoral system? Does it still exaggerate the lead of the largest party over the second party? What is it doing about third-party MPs? You can probably guess a little bit about what I'm going to say there. And then I want to move on to what are the implications of my analysis to that stage for the prospects for the two-party system. And with that, to do that, I will also be bringing in some other information about, as it were, the legacy and the circumstances in which the British Parliament and British government currently finds itself. Okay, so question number 1, holding the government to account. Well, there is no doubt that the public were pretty disgruntled before the 2024 election. One of the reasons why they were disgruntled was to do with the state of the economy, and in particular, their own living standards. This is data from British Social Attitudes, which I have some responsibility for running. And as you can see, over the decade since 2010, but particularly during the course of the last Parliament, the proportion of people who said that they felt comfortable living on their household income, which is the blue line, went markedly down, and the proportion of people who said they were struggling, that's the bottom line, went up. Life economically was particularly tough in the 2019 to 24 Parliament for reasons that everybody in this room will be aware. And indeed, if we analyse how people voted in 2024, we can see that indeed their evaluations of the economy were very clearly related to how they voted. Now, this is a wee bit complicated, so let me just walk you through it slightly. So what I'm looking at here are people who voted Conservative in 2019. So these are the folk who, in a sense, have either got to give the government a tick or a cross, so far as its record is concerned. And I'm then dividing those voters up into 4 groups, and it's the same 4 groups for the 3 parts of the graph. On the left-hand side are those people who said, just before the election, the economy is getting a lot worse. There were quite a lot of them. And then there are those who thought it was getting a little worse, and then on the far right-hand one of the quadrant is those who thought the economy was getting better. And the first quartet of histograms is showing you the proportion of people who just before the 2024 election in each of those 4 groups said that they were going to vote Conservative again. And yes, you've got it. They were much less likely to say they would vote Conservative again if they thought the economy was doing badly. That is what they are meant to do, according to the model. What did they do? Well, some of them went to Labour, but equally, and this is important to understand, Reform, I'll come back to this later on, Reform were also picking up people amongst those who were economically unhappy. So voters didn't just go, I'm unhappy, I'm going to vote for the opposition. Some of them voted for somebody other than one of the 2 parties of government. Second obvious difficult area is the state of the NHS. Again, this is British Social Attitudes. People's levels of satisfaction. The blue line are those folk who said they are satisfied. The red line, those who are dissatisfied. This is the history all the way back to 1983. The crucial point to note is that in the wake of the pandemic and the realization that by stopping most forms of elective care for a good 12 months or so, we had created the world's longest waiting list for the NHS. Satisfaction with the NHS went down the tubes, that's the blue line going down, and dissatisfaction rose. So this was a second crucial concern that the electorate had by the time of the 2024 election. And again, doing the same kind of analysis, right? So again, 2019, Tory voters broken down according to their evaluation as to whether or not they thought the NHS was a lot worse or whether it's getting better. And again, as you can see, people who thought the NHS was getting a lot worse were a lot less likely to say they would vote Conservative again than those who were of the very opposite opinion. So voters were holding the government to account, but again, they didn't just necessarily go to Labour, they sometimes went to Reform. Indeed, if we actually look at where 2019 Conservative voters went in July of last year, the principal destination of those people who did not vote Conservative again was Reform. And that does therefore mean that a fundamental foundation of Labour's ability to get an overall majority is not simply because of people switching to them. It was also actually, and I know this is very uncomfortable for many people inside the Labour Party, it was also the very high willingness of 2019 Tory voters to vote for Reform. And without that, life might have been a little bit different. So another crucial point is, in a sense, the model works. Voters were holding the government to account, but what they then did doesn't simply fit the prescriptions of the two-party model. And it wasn't just the government that was held to account. Keir Starmer was held to account in a very, very substantial fashion in any constituency that had a substantial number of people who identify as Muslim. Labour's vote effectively collapsed in constituencies with large number of Muslims, and they did so, of course, because they were not happy with Sir Keir Starmer's initial reaction to Labour's response to the incursion by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. Indeed, pretty much everybody was held to account. In Scotland, as you will all be aware, the electorate held the SNP to account. And the SNP support fell very substantially. And I could show you that that was very clearly linked to people's evaluations of the NHS in Scotland in much the same way was true of the Tories south of the border. But equally also in Wales, Labour's support fell away. And there aren't that many Muslims in Wales, right? And again, it looks as though people in Wales held the devolved Welsh government to account also. Being in government sucked last year. It was not good for your electoral prospects because whoever was the party of government basically lost out. But therefore, again, our two-party model is not just simply working on its own. It's partly working, but actually voters are doing lots of other things as well. Now, that said, of course, one consequence of holding the SNP to account north of the border is that the bit of Great Britain where, frankly, the two-party model had already disappeared, and it's still not really back, was in Scotland in 2015, but the point was that with Labour again dominating Scotland's representation at Westminster, to some degree at least, Scotland was reintegrated into the British two-party model, albeit not to a full degree. So here, as it were, again, we see seemingly the two-party model gaining ground in an area of previous strength, previous weakness. Now, let me then move on to my second point, the underpinnings. Now, you will often hear it said that Brexit is yesterday's story. Nobody cares about it anymore, and it doesn't matter, and it's all over. There is one thing I hope you will take away from this evening. It is that that is a misunderstanding of where we are in British politics. Here, for example, is looking at how people voted last year, broken down by what their view then was about Brexit. So this is comparing the people who would vote to rejoin on the left-hand side with those people who said that they would vote to stay out. And what you will notice is that very few rejoiners voted for Conservative or for Reform. And for the most part, rejoiners voted for Labour and the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. There was a very sharp division. Yes, the Conservative Party lost a whole barrel load of Reform voters, and this was the beginning of where we are now at, which is basically the complete erosion of the Johnsonian coalition of 2019. But you can see it's essentially Reform that was then picking them up. So in terms of actually the link between what were people's views about Brexit and how they voted, the division in 2024 was almost as sharp as it was in 2019. And Brexit was deeply disruptive of our politics because it wasn't an issue that divided people by class. It was an issue that divided people by age and by education. And it wasn't an issue that divided people left versus right. Rather, it was an issue that divided people according to what perhaps loosely these days we call the culture wars. It divided social liberals who are more relaxed about immigration, who value equalities policies, happy living in a diverse society, versus social conservatives who say, no, society needs, in order to have social cohesion, it needs to impose a moral code on people, people should be following similar social mores, people should be speaking the same language, etc., etc. That was the central ideological division in 2016. And as people's vote in 2016 began to influence how they voted in 2017 and 2019, it disrupted our politics. The link between class and vote disappeared by 2019. But the question is, what happened in 2024? Answer, not very much. And certainly nothing that restored the link between class and vote. Conservative Party, this is data from BSA, other sources are available, they all roughly agree with each other. There are some differences. But the Conservative Party, effectively, a little bit more popular amongst those in professional managerial occupations, but only a bit. On BSA data, Labour, quite a lot more popular amongst professional managerial folk than working class folk. Other data suggests that basically there just wasn't much difference. Certainly, one of Labour's fundamental aims in 2020, which was to reconnect with working class Leave voters, that project did not go very far at all. Labour tries now to talk about it being the party of working people, but the working people include an awful lot of people in high-range middle-class jobs, not just people in working-class occupations. So point one, therefore, the fundamental demographic division, the social anchor of our two-party system, the link between class and vote, is still not with us. It wasn't just Brexit that resulted in its end. There was a longer-term trend before that, but the end of that the relationship has not been reversed. It was just as evident in 2024. In contrast, the biggest demographic division now in our politics is age. Older people vote for the Conservatives and for Reform. Younger people vote for Labour, the Democrats, and now quite markedly for the Greens. And this was something that Labour, actually the link between age and Labour support is weaker in 2024 than in 2019 because of the Greens taking up a lot of the younger vote. But the crucial point is here you've got big differences, unlike the previous slide. And also, frankly, education is also a fundamental division. It's linked to Brexit. So the Conservative Party and Reform are much more popular amongst people who have something less than a higher or an A level. The Labour Party is much more popular amongst university graduates. Yes, those ranks of Labour MPs who are university graduates, almost to a man and a woman, are indeed representative of their electorate, so far as that particular quality is concerned, much as many of them would not want to admit it. And again, you can see both the Liberal Democrats and the Greens are also parties of graduates. So the social anchor, the traditional social anchor of our two-party system isn't with us. What about the value divide? Well, as I've said, Brexit was primarily about social liberals versus social conservatives. This is tracing through for you the link between where people stand on that spectrum, as measured by British social attitudes, and their likelihood of voting Conservative or Labour. So if I take that one figure on the top left-hand side, that means that back in 2001, social liberals were only 1 percentage point more likely to vote Labour than social conservatives. Basically, it didn't matter. And even in the case of the Conservatives, they were just a little bit more popular amongst social conservatives than social liberals. But as you can see in 2017 and 2019, for Conservative and Labour, this value division became more important. Not that the left-right divide disappeared. Indeed, it was still very substantial. But as you can see here, for example, if we look at what happened back in 2019, Labour is 39 points more popular amongst people on the left than on the right, and the Conservatives are 45 points more popular amongst those on the right than on the left. So it's not that the left-right divide disappeared, but it no longer necessarily dominates. We now have two value dimensions that are central to our politics. And for those of you who've got any kind of ability at geometry at all, will realise that if these two dimensions cut across each other, which to a fair degree they do, there are four possible places you can occupy in the occupational spot, in the value spectrum, which are distinct, which makes it much more difficult to maintain a two-party system. But in fact, the value division is not just a value division between Conservative and Labour, albeit it primarily was in 2019. Though again, notice, however, the secret's in the name. The Liberal Democrats tend to get a lot of social liberals, as so do the Greens to some degree. But effectively in 2019, if you put the two blocks together, so you compare the division for Conservative and Reform versus Labour versus Liberal Democrats and Green, effectively the two dimensions are more or less equally important in terms of demarcating the structure of support. And this is where we were in 2024. So, yep, the Conservatives are more popular amongst those who are social conservatives, and Labour are more popular amongst those who are social liberals, though in both cases the division is not quite so sharp as it was in 2019. But look at Reform. What identifies a Reform voter is their social conservatism. They're a little bit on the right, and that distinguishes them from UKIP. UKIP voters were never on the right. But essentially, Reform are the party of the second value dimension. The Greens are also very much distinguished on that dimension, though they are also on the left, and Polanski's combination of left and social liberalism fits the ideological profile of supporters perfectly well. So again, if you put the two blocks together, you discover that actually the second dimension, the social liberal, social conservative dimension, thanks to the rise of Reform, actually divided the parties collectively more than the left-right division did. So the ideological anchor of the two-party system, it's not disappeared, but shall we say there's another anchor that's dragging the ship in an opposite direction. And the ship, as it's tossed in the sea, is in danger of being pulled in one direction and then in the other, and maybe in the end at risk of breaking up, question mark. Okay. Now, Labour winning. Well, let's look a bit more closely at the 2024 election result. In one sense, the system worked perfectly. Labour got an overall majority. The voters turfed the Tories out, and they got a Labour government in its place. And that element of the system still clearly worked, though I'll show you in a moment to some degree why that happened. But there are lots of other things about the election result that don't fit. No previous government has got a majority of any kind on 35% of the vote, let alone a majority of 174. The Conservatives ended up with their lowest share all the way back since and including 1832, which therefore means that the combined share of the vote for Conservative and Labour was less than 60% for the first time since 1922. we have more third-party MPs than ever. We had more votes for parties other than Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrats than ever. We had more parties other than Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat elected in England since 1918. And by the way, we now have a more variegated Parliament at Westminster than ever before. We have 14 different parties who have at least one representative inside the House of Commons. So in particular then, when it comes to what happened to the ability of the system to keep third parties out, it failed in a fashion that has not been seen since the 1920s. Yet in truth, the ability of Labour to get an overall majority does seem rather astounding. Not simply because he got 35% of the vote, but because people like me were going around before the election saying, well, you do realise, don't you, that the electoral geography is very disadvantageous to Labour, and Labour will need a lead of about 13, 14 points before they have a chance of getting an overall majority, when, of course, in the end, they got a lead of 11 points and got a really, really big majority. So the system changed. Well, of course, the truth about first past the post, and this is fundamental to our evaluation of the extent to which it is able to provide an underpinning to the two-party system. How first past the post operates depends on geography. And in 2024, the geography changed fundamentally, both with respect to its ability to deliver an executive majority, it enhanced it, but also in terms of its ability to keep third parties out, the change geography weakened it. Labour was able to do so well, get a big majority, because A, the Conservative vote fell more heavily in places where they were previously strongest, therefore they lost about 100 more MPs than would otherwise be the case. And secondly, voters were so concerned to keep the Conservatives out that basically those who at least who weren't just going to vote for reform and didn't care about the consequences, if they were living in a constituency where Labour was second, they went off and voted Labour. And if they were living in a constituency where the Democrats were second, they went off and voted for the Liberal Democrats. There was a very high level of tactical voting, more than we've seen before. And so therefore you can see how Labour's vote goes up by 61 points, and apart from Scotland, nowhere else does it go up in anything like that fashion. Indeed, it frankly rarely goes up at all. And the Democrats go up in constituencies where they were starting off second, and again, frankly, anywhere else, it rarely goes up at all. And so the phenomenon of the Tories losing ground where they were previously strongest, this phenomenon of tactical voting, and indeed Labour's success in Scotland, those three ingredients turn around an electoral geography that was potentially disadvantageous to the party. And indeed, as a result of this, I won't go into you can ask me in the Q&A if you want, I won't go into the methodology of this, but I have long been using a measure of the number of seats that are marginal between Conservative and Labour. And this measure is always based on the assumption that what would be the position if the two parties were even Stevens in terms of the national share of the vote. So therefore, it takes out the changes in the popularity of the parties. There was a big decline in the number of seats that were marginal in the 70s and 80s. I wrote about that, God knows, more years ago than I care to remember. And it's never really been restored. And the hung parliament of 2015, the small majority of 2017, the hung parliament of 2010. These were not accidents. These were consequences of the lack of marginal seats. But we do now have rather more marginal seats because Labour's vote, it went up in marginal seats. It didn't do much in where they were weak. It went down where they were previously strong. The Tories went down where they were previously strongest. So both parties' votes became geographically much more evenly spread, and that increases the number of marginal seats. This I've already said, right? This is just the trend in the share that the vote won by Conservative and Labour combined. After a long-term trend of apparent decline being reversed in 2017 and 2019, it was reversed and fell again. And this is just the number of third-party MPs. We now have 117 of them, and that's the highest number since 1923. And there is the Liberal Party that you could take a whole of them in a taxi to Brighton there in the 1960s. So while the system, on the one hand, the changed geography enabled the system to work as better at what it should do, so far as keeping third-party MPs, it did so worse. Though those third-party MPs, of course, had a third-party MPs had very varied experiences, and again, this helps to explain it. You know that, again, one of the other things that we all thought we knew about British politics, right? The Liberal Democrat votes more evenly spread than Conservative and Labour. Rub that one out, it's no longer true, okay? The Liberal Democrat vote is now more geographically concentrated than that of the Conservatives, because the Conservative votes become very evenly spread, and it's almost as geographically concentrated as Labour, which does therefore mean that although they came fourth in terms of votes, because their votes geographically concentrated, which is exactly what it needs to be if you're going to get votes under single-member plurality and you're third or fourth, it's the rise of Liberal Democrats as a result of that tactical voting that essentially enabled them to get a record number of MPs. And that, together with Labour's difficulties in Muslim seats, provides a lot of the explanation as to why the number of third-party MPs goes up. And again, in Muslim seats, the independent vote is very heavily concentrated. Reforms vote very evenly spread, much like UKIP in 2015. The Greens also applied, of course, it's concentrated. And the SNP in Scotland are evenly spread as well, although it's concentrated in Scotland. So the result of this, therefore, is a real paradox, because we've got a more variegated parliament than ever, and that doesn't look like a two-party parliament at all. But it is dominated by one of the two governing parties, but at the same time, it has lots of third-party MPs. You put all that together, and we have a parliament where the relationship between seats and votes is weaker than it ever has been. Right, and so it doesn't matter which index you use. This is an index of disproportionality. It is now higher than it's been at any stage since the Liberal Party started fighting seats throughout Great Britain. So we have the people inside, as I now try to explain to most journalists, if you wish to understand the structure of British electoral politics, the last place you should look is the chamber of the House of Commons. It is completely and utterly misleading. And it fundamentally, in that sense, misrepresents where we are at. Though, of course, in part, that's what the two-party model is meant to do. But the disproportionality is not just because of Labour's lead being exaggerated over the Conservatives. It's also the different ways in which the system treats third parties, and allowing any of them to gain support is not meant to be part of what it's about. What's also true as a result of the very changed electoral geography is that it is now a minority of constituencies in Great Britain where Conservative and Labour share first and second place. So the idea that electoral competition is between Conservative and Labour, for the most part, in most of the country, you don't have to talk about this in Scotland anymore. This is now true of most constituencies. So here again, you can see how the underlying structure looks very different from what we'd expect. So to summarise so far, before I go to the last part, there are elements of the system that work. Labour got a majority. It exaggerated the lead of the largest party over the second party. The left-right divide still exists. But in other respects, it looks weak. The two governing parties had a record low share of the vote. The social anchor of the traditional social anchor of their support has disappeared. The left-right divide has to compete with the social liberal, social conservative divide, which provides a very important potential foundation for some of our third parties. We've got a record number of third-party MPs, and we've now got an electoral geography that means that most constituencies are not Conservative versus Labour battles. So it's not all one direction a critique, but there are clearly some potential weaknesses. And it always left, in the wake of that, wither Britain's two-party system. And the last 12 months have demonstrated the potential importance of that question. But let me now just do what I said I was going to do, just introduce a little bit more the context within which all of this has happened and why this matters. It's now a cliche, but here's the slide to prove that it's true. Trust and confidence in how we are governed is now either at or equal, at least, to being a record low. This is actually a question that goes all the way back to the Kilbrandon Commission report of 1973. It's the blue line are those people who say that the system of governing Britain doesn't need a great deal of improvement. The red line are those who say it needs a great deal of improvement. There are lots of ups and downs. We certainly were concerned about how we were being governed in the late 1990s. But basically, particularly if you kind of start in 1997 and just try to fit a straight line, you can see the proportion of people who think it needs more improvement has been going up, and the proportion who think it doesn't need much improvement has been going down. Similar story with trust. Trust goes up and down. It varies over time. There are various spikes. The whole sleaze row surrounding John Major was crucial in undermining political trust. We've never recovered from that. The MP's expenses scandal didn't do it any good. Brexit actually, by the way, did good to trust in government, because the people who voted Leave said, hallelujah, at last we've got a government that does what we told them to do. The trouble is Leave voters have now got very disappointed about Brexit, so they no longer trust British governments either, along with Remainers. You will see that immediately after the election, that's the penultimate reading, trust improved a bit. That usually happens after election. Holding election is good for trust, but notice that when we went back into to the public again just in September or October last year, it had already gone back to what it was, and it's the first time that's happened so quickly. So we have low levels of trust, low levels of confidence. And these things are not just about process. I've talked about the MP's expenses scandal. I've talked about sleaze. It's also a consequence of people's perceptions of what the state of the country. So here you can see, for example, that people who are dissatisfied with NHS, there are lots of them, you saw that earlier, are less likely to feel that there doesn't need to be much improvement to our government than those folk who think it's okay. So if you think the system of the NHS, you're unhappy with the NHS, you are much less likely to feel, if you're unhappy with the NHS, you're much less likely to say that the system of governing Britain needs a great deal of improvement. Equally, if you feel you are struggling on your household income, you are less likely to trust governments, and you are more likely to feel that the system of government needs improvement. And indeed, to deal with another policy issue that I've not focused on so much so far, if you feel that migration into Britain undermines Britain's culture, you are much more likely to think that our system of government needs improvement. You are much less likely to trust governments than if you think that migrants enrich our culture. And the same is true of the economic argument. So those three big policy challenges that the current government is trying to wrestle with is trying to wrestle with them when A, there is a lot of discontent, when B, they're undermining people's trust and confidence in the system. Oh, and by the way, do people think the current incumbent government are doing a good job of handling the economy? Increasingly not. Or the NHS? Well, the rot is stopped, but we still got 70% of people who feel that they're not improving the NHS. So this government that was elected to deal with these difficult issues on a foundation where I've shown it has all sorts of limitations to it, is seen to be felt to be wanted. And in those circumstances, there was always going to be a question as to where voters would go. If you were unhappy with the incumbent government, were you going to vote for an opposition that you had just thrown out summarily and whose brand reputation for competence had been completely shredded by the 2019 to 24 Parliament, particularly when there are all these other options that are now represented in Parliament with non-trivial shares of the vote. That was always the question that was going to hang over us. And indeed, we can see, for example, if we look at the extent, break down how people voted in 2024, and we look at their level of trust in government and their perception of whether the system of governing Britain needs improvement. Yep, you've guessed it. Reform voters think the system sucks. They do not think the system of governing Britain is working. It needs a great deal of improvement. And they are largely joined in that perception by people who voted for the Greens. The two big challenger parties were appealing in particular to people who felt that the system of governing Britain had inadequacies, whereas everybody else, they either think it's okay or at least not too bad. The same is true of trust. Those who voted reform, nearly all to a man and a woman, do not trust governments to put the country's interests first. Green voters are very similar in that respect. Liberal Democrats are a bit like that too, but otherwise there isn't a great deal of difference. And indeed, it's not just this kind of relatively rarefied sense of trust that reform voters are articulating. They're also deeply, deeply sceptical about the ability of either Labour or the Conservatives to turn these problems around. These are data from Survation from a couple of months ago. It's actually difficult to put on a slide the real true story. But first of all, lo and behold, surprise, surprise, reform voters, for the most part, ask whether or not they trust Keir Starmer to handle the economy, the health, immigration. They almost all of them say no. But they're also not so sceptical about the Conservatives, but they're pretty sceptical. But the thing you really need to understand is in the kind of verbiage at the bottom. Reform voters are more sceptical about Labour's ability to handle these issues than our Conservative supporters. And Reform supporters are more sceptical about the Conservatives' ability to handle these issues than are Labour voters. To use a term that we commonly use north of the border, they're scunnered. So they don't trust the system, they think it needs improvement, and they also don't have confidence in the ability of the two principal traditional parties of government to deliver. And lo and behold, it is Reform that has been able to be the party that's profited from the structural weaknesses I've tried to point out in the two-party system and the particular contingent circumstances within which the current government is having to operate. So Reform has been running at 31% since basically the English local elections. Oh, by the way, just in case you want to know, Rayner's made no difference. Mandelson's made no difference. This is structural. It's not to do with the particular events going on in Westminster. Sorry to say that in the Study of Parliament lecture, but it happens to be true. Labour's gone down, the Tories have gone down, the Liberal Democrats are holding up, the Greens are holding up. Actually, the Greens look as though they're now picking up in the wake of Polanski becoming leader, so that potential challenge is also there. At the moment, what Reform are primarily doing, they're basically having the Tories for lunch, breakfast and dinner. They're taking their voters, they're beginning to take their MPs, they've certainly taken a lot of their ex-MPs, they've taken a lot of their activists, and they're beginning to take some of their donors. And of course, one possible end point of where we are at the moment is that all that will happen is that Nigel Farage will achieve his ambition of replacing the Conservative Party as the principal party of the centre-right in this country, and we might revert back to a two-party system. And we are simply going through a process of changing who one of those two parties in much the same way as we did in the 1920s. He's certainly having a fair degree of success on that at the moment. But still notice, it is only 30%. It's less than Labour got last year. Hang on to that, because I'm going to show you why that matters in a moment. Because here's the English local elections, when basically Reform got around the number you would get given their 30% in the opinion polls. They got about 30% of the vote in the local elections. Not long after the 2024 election, I was giving a talk at Westminster. I wanted to Labour MPs present say, the great thing about the electoral system, it kept reform out. And I went, well, it didn't really, and it certainly isn't now. First, if you think about it, the only reason at the moment why on 30% of the vote it is possible that Nigel Farage might be getting an overall majority is because of the electoral system. It would be utterly impossible under proportional representation, and it's probably going to stop the move to the proportional representation in Wales is probably going to stop Reform from forming the next government in Wales. But the point now is that first past the post will potentially further undermine the two-party system as we've come to know it, rather than reinforce it. Oh, and by the way, Brexit. And this is again important to understand. Reform voters already said they're unhappy. They're the disconsolate. They are the folk who've lost trust. But they're also the Brexiteers. Support for reform is running at over 50% amongst those people who voted Leave in 2016. So it isn't just a bunch of unhappy folk who will disappear automatically the moment a Labour government manages to turn things around, assuming that it does. It's also representing a very distinct ideological section of our society, an ideological section of our society which is organised around the social liberal, social conservative spectrum and not primarily around the left versus right divide. And you can see why I said earlier that Reform have taken the Johnsonian coalition. The Conservative Party is now barely any more popular amongst people who voted Leave than it is amongst those people who voted Reform. Oh yes, and the Labour Party is still got a bunch of Remoaners. Final thought, which is, well, so maybe the question of the electoral system is now open to question, and I've, in various ways, indicated how, to some degree at least, the traditional defence of that electoral system in the way it supports the two-party model can now be questioned, and it may indeed now be a catalyst rather than a barrier to change. But the other interesting thing is that actually public opinion now seems to have lost confidence in the electoral system. This is data from British society. It's been asked since 1983. It's a question whose wording has historically not been kind to the pro-PR cause. It basically says, do you think we should keep the existing system of government, the existing electoral system, because it provides Britain with strong government, or should we change the system to make it fairer to smaller parties? You can see the wording is kind of, arguably a little bit in one direction. The blue line are the folk who said that we should change the system. The red line are those who said that we should keep the existing system. During the course of the last Parliament, for the first time, we began to get a consistent majority, or at least a plurality of people saying we should change the system, primarily because Labour voters who had lost their confidence in the ability of the electoral system to deliver them another victory had changed their minds. But actually now, post the election, support for changing the system is now at a record high. More remarkably, the supporters of every single party, including the Conservatives, are now in favour. The Tories have learnt their lesson very, very quickly. Reform and the Liberal Democrats haven't yet at least caught up with the changed circumstances and probably never will. The Labour Party, well, wait and see. I suspect that people might change their minds. And of course, there's now a lot of questions to whether Reform are going to continue to back changing the electoral system, given that now, under current circumstances, the system might change. So the politics of all this might change. But certainly one can say that, again, another linchpin of the traditional system has disappeared. So this is, my conclusion as to where we are so far as the two-party model is concerned. So, yes, it did hold the Conservatives to account. The electoral system did facilitate alternating governments, though it did so primarily through changes in the geography of support, which were fundamental, and also, crucially, the result of people switching not to Labour, but switching to Reform. Yet at the same time, Labour were held to account, as indeed were the SNP north of the border, including in Labour's case by people voting for the Greens or the Independents, or indeed for George Galloway's party in Muslim areas. But it's just that those third parties got very unevenly rewarded. It has left us with a more variegated parliament than ever before, but also a more unrepresentative one than ever before. Arguably one is fine, both is perhaps a paradoxical and maybe undesirable mixture. The left-right divide, a traditional left-right divide, is not with us. The majority of constituencies are no longer Conservative Labour battles. The relationship between class and vote has disappeared. Brexit's disruption is still with us. And all of this ended up with us having a government elected with a very low share of the vote, but with a very formidable policy challenge, and in circumstances of low trust and confidence, and without it being obvious that the traditional two-party model had an alternative governing party that was available to the electorate to vote for. And so, Nigel Farage has taken his opportunity.